Sometimes you catch yourself doing it without even noticing. You're walking somewhere, maybe in your room, maybe outside, and you quietly say something to yourself. A full sentence, a thought spoken out loud. Maybe you replay a conversation that already happened. Maybe you explain something to yourself as if you're thinking through it. And if someone else heard it, they might find it strange. But people who talk to themselves often aren't usually confused. In many cases, they're doing something very specific with their mind. Because talking to yourself is not always about being alone. Sometimes it's about how your brain processes the world. And people who do this regularly tend to share a few psychological qualities that most others don't even realize they have. One of the first things this behavior often reveals is a very active inner dialogue. Most people think silently. Their thoughts stay inside their head, vague and moving quickly from one idea to another. But when someone talks to themselves, something slightly different is happening. The mind is slowing down the thought process. It's taking something abstract and turning it into something structured. When you say a thought out loud, even quietly, the brain organizes it differently. It becomes clearer, more concrete, almost like the mind is holding a conversation with itself. And people who do this often tend to have a stronger relationship with their own thinking. They don't just experience thoughts, they examine them. Not because they're trying to analyze everything, but because their mind naturally turns inward. Another thing that shows up in people who talk to themselves frequently is a higher level of self-awareness. Not the kind people talk about on social media, but the quieter kind. The kind where you notice your own reactions while they're happening. Maybe you say something to yourself after a moment passes. Why did I react like that? Or maybe you replay a conversation and quietly comment on it. Next time I should say it differently. This isn't always about correcting yourself. It's often about understanding yourself. Because speaking a thought forces you to acknowledge it. You can't hide it in the background of your mind anymore. It becomes something you can observe. And people who do this regularly tend to develop a deeper awareness of their own patterns, emotions, and behaviors over time.
But there's another layer to this that people don't usually talk about. Talking to yourself can also be a sign of emotional self-regulation. Sometimes when a person speaks to themselves quietly, they're not just thinking, they're stabilizing their emotions. Maybe they say something like, "It's fine, just relax," or they rehearse what they want to say before an important moment. To an outside observer, it might look odd, but psychologically, something important is happening. The brain is using language to guide emotional states, almost like an internal anchor. Instead of reacting impulsively to feelings, the person creates a small pause, a moment where the mind steps back and organizes itself. And that small habit often appears in people who are naturally reflective, people who process things deeply before moving forward. But here's where it gets interesting. Most people assume talking to yourself is just a random habit, something people do when they're bored or distracted. But the real reason often runs deeper than that. For many people, it's connected to how they developed independence in their thinking. When someone grows used to relying on their own mind to process experiences, their thoughts naturally become more conversational. They become both the speaker and the listener, both the question and the answer. And over time, that creates something unusual, a kind of internal companionship with your own mind. Not loneliness, not isolation, but familiarity. the person becomes comfortable exploring ideas, reactions, and emotions without immediately needing someone else's input. And that's a rare mental skill in a world where most people look outward for validation or clarity. Another quality that often appears in people who talk to themselves is stronger cognitive processing. When thoughts stay purely internal, they can remain messy, unfinished. But when a thought is spoken, even quietly, it activates additional parts of the brain. Language centers engage, memory pathways activate. Ideas become easier to organize and recall. That's why you'll often notice people whispering something to themselves when trying to remember something important or when working through a complex problem. It's not randomness, it's the brain using sound and language to reinforce thinking. In fact, many creative thinkers and problem solvers naturally do this without realizing it. They externalize pieces of their thinking process, not for attention, but because it helps their mind build clearer connections. And there's another subtle trait hidden in this behavior. People who talk to themselves often have a higher tolerance for solitude, not because they prefer being alone all the time, but because their mind is rarely empty. Their thoughts create activity, reflection, conversation. They can walk somewhere alone and still feel mentally engaged, not distracted, not bored, just thinking. And that kind of internal engagement changes how someone experiences the world. They become more observant, more reflective, more aware of patterns in behavior, both in themselves and in others. Because when someone regularly listens to their own thoughts, they also become better at recognizing the thoughts behind other people's actions. So when you look at it from the outside, talking to yourself might seem like a small habit, something people do absent-mindedly. A quiet sentence spoken under your breath, a question asked out loud when no one else is around. But inside the mind, something more complex is happening. It's the brain organizing thoughts, regulating emotions, exploring ideas, building awareness. And over time, that habit often reflects deeper psychological qualities, a strong inner dialogue, higher self-awareness, emotional self-regulation, independent thinking, and a mind that naturally reflects on itself. Once you start noticing that pattern, it changes the way the behavior looks. What seemed strange starts to look intentional. What seemed random begins to reveal structure. And in many cases, people who talk to themselves aren't lost in their thoughts. They're simply more familiar with them. And sometimes that quiet conversation with your own mind is just the brain doing what it does best, trying to understand itself. And once you recognize that pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. Not as something unusual, but as a different way the mind makes sense of the world. If this explained something about the way your mind works, there's always more to uncover, because understanding your own patterns is where awareness really begins.